Alright, so here we are with Bant Eldrazi. This opener is not exciting. I think I am going to keep it. Would like to see an Eldrazi temple, but we have 4 lands and 3 spells. Our opponent's on a mulligan, so we can beat a lot of medium draws with this hand. We're not going to beat a lot of super aggressive combo draws with this hand, because turn 4 Thought Knot on the draw is a lot less powerful than turn 3 Thought Knot. But being able to go Mattery Shaper into Thought Knot into Reality Smasher isn't bad. It looks like our opponent is playing Affinity and has a pretty good start here, so that could definitely be bad news. Alright, so we drew Eldrazi's Sky Spawner, which is kind of unique to the list I'm playing. And in this sort of a situation, it can help us blocking a Signal Pest or an Inkmoth Nexus. Although if our opponent just has the nuts, and it looks like that may be the case with the Cranial Plating here, we may just be dead. I mean, if we draw Eldrazi Temple, that would certainly be a nice one. Yavimaya Coast is not what we wanted to see. So this is real bad. Not gonna lie about it. Not gonna sugarcoat it. Affinity is a matchup that is not particularly favorable for this deck. We do have some sideboard cards, but you saw how Pascal Maynard lost to Affinity in the top 4 of GPLA, and yeah, I mean, Affinity's still one of the best decks in Modern. We're going to be taking 8 here, going down to 6, unless it looks like an instant speed moving of Cranial Plating. So it actually, that's going to put us on 9 poison, so it looks like our opponent is prioritizing the Inkmoth Nexus damage rather than regular damage. Let's just go ahead and play our Eldrazi Sky Spawner. So we're gonna have to block the Inkmoth Nexus, but we're gonna be taking everything else, and everything else is still a ton of damage. So we'll see if our opponent has another artifact to play. Okay, it looks like our opponent has not activated Inkmoth, so I think we can just go ahead and block Signal Pest here and see what our opponent's gonna do. So there's Cranial Plating getting moved onto Ornithopter, so we take 8, but we still have Eldrazi Sky Spawner in play, so not sure our opponent played that turn correctly, honestly. But we're still in kind of a rough spot. So if we do just play Thought Knot Seer here, then our opponent can instant speed equip the Cranial Plating to the Ornithopter we don't block, and that would be lethal. So let's just start with an Ancient Stirrings, and it looks like we didn't find anything that we wanted. So now we're just going to hope our opponent doesn't see the play, and we're just going to play Thought Knot this turn, and we're dead on board to the Ornithopters. So we do get to snap that Galvanic Blast, but our opponent can activate the Inkmoth Nexus for the 6th artifact and then equip Cranial Plating in whichever way they choose. So we'll see if that actually happens. There it is, and then expect the Inkmoth Nexus to get activated. Or was that completely lethal? Looks like it was. Okay, so that was lethal damage, and on to the next game. So, against Affinity, we want to be boarding in Stony Silence for sure. We have Dismember and Gutshot, which are a couple spot removal spells, which we definitely want. We have Fracturing Gust and Engineered Explosives. So we just want a bunch of ways to interact with our opponent's creatures more specifically. And we want to take out our creatures that aren't really impacting the game that much. Cards like Reality Smasher are a little bit slow, so we can shave a couple of Reality Smashers. We can completely cut the Matter Reshapers. And so we're just kind of making our deck a bit leaner for the matchup. Spellskite is okay. It isn't particularly good in conjunction when you have a Stony Silence in play. So that's definitely worth noting. But I think we just want to go ahead and shave some of our bigger cards, because once we get to the late game, at that point we are a big favorite. So as long as we have some Drowners and a Reality Smasher here or there, we should be able to win. Thought Knot is also somewhat of a liability. It's pretty good. You don't normally want to draw multiples. We just want to make our deck leaner, because sometimes your opponent will have already dumped your hand even by the time Thought Knot's getting online. So we're just going to go down to taking out some of our big Eldrazi spells, putting in more cheap interaction, and that's the plan. We still have Eldrazi Displacer, which can completely take over a game if we have one of our Drowners in play. So this is just a good hand, exactly what we're looking for against Affinity. We've got our main piece of hate for the matchup in Stony Silence. We've also got a turn 3 Thought Knot Seer, so can't really ask for too much more. If our opponent has an answer to the Stony Silence, though, things can definitely get interesting. If our opponent doesn't have an answer to the Stony Silence, it should be difficult for us to lose here. Alright, so to kick things off, just to save some life, let's go ahead and get a basic forest. And I like just starting on our best 1-drop, which is Noble. Birds is a secondary 1-drop, essentially. So Noble we can use to attack if we want to, and it also produces our third color in blue, so it gives us everything we want. Looks like our opponent has a pretty good draw, but a lot of artifacts that are going to get completely blanked as soon as we play this Stony Silence. So yeah, let's go ahead and play it. We can play the birds and play Stony Silence this turn. So let's do that. We also have a colorless land, which can allow us to cast Thought Knot Seer on our third turn. The Ghost Quarter we can use on this Glimmer Void if we want to. A lot of times there's a basic mountain in these lists, so we may want to use that Ghost Quarter. In fact, I think we probably are going to want to use it, but let's go ahead and lead off on the Thought Knot Seer first. We'll see what we're up against here. Alright, so it's just Master of Ethereum and Mox Opal. So we're going to take the Master and play the Ghost Quarter. And I think I like just going ahead and using the Ghost Quarter right now. We could do it upkeep, so after our opponent's drawn, to see if our opponent draws the mountain. But there are some single colored cards, like say if our opponent draws a Dispatch or something like that, we're happy we used the Ghost Quarter immediately. And we're going to take some damage from this Vault Scourge, it looks like, but We just drew Eldrazi Displacer, so our opponent's not going to be able to do too much unless they draw an answer to Stony Silence. We're also winning this race as it stands right now. And our opponent's basically clocking us for 2. We're dealing 7, plus on our next turn we're going to have access to the Eldrazi Displacer. So we could block with our birds, but there's really no need to. And it looks like our opponent's just passing the turn here. Nothing too scary. And there's a path, so we can use that if we want to. But we're just going to get in for 7 right now. Most Affinity decks only play 1 basic, some play 2. But it looks like it's just going to be on to the next game. So, being on the play or draw is pretty relevant. Our Eldrazi creatures actually get a little bit worse. We already took a lot of them out. We're still going to be keeping in the engineered explosives, the silences. All of this interaction that we boarded in, we're going to keep in. The question becomes, do we want to trade off any of these Eldrazi creatures? We can play, for instance, a second Reality Smasher, or we can board in Matter Reshapers. Our most powerful Eldrazi is Drowner, but it's also the one that costs the most mana. So I don't think we really need to do anything after board. This configuration seems quite solid. We can board out maybe one more Thought Knot, just because we're pretty unlikely to hit with Thought Knot if our opponent's got a good hand. So we have an option of what we want to board in. We definitely don't want to draw a double Thought Knot. We'd rather have Thought Knot plus Reality Smasher, or Thought Knot plus Drowner. So we can just board in a second Smasher just to kind of help fill out our curve. And that way we've got a solid amount of cards that can just win us the game, even without a Stony Silence. So yeah, pretty happy with this. And we're basically hoping, if our opponent has a very good draw like we saw in Game 1, then we're hoping for some of our hate cards. This hand that we're looking at right now does have one piece of hate, but based on our lands and engineered explosives, none of these lands can actually make any colors for engineered explosives. We are going to keep this just based on the fact that we have a turn 2 Thought Knot potentially, which is clearly very powerful, but if our opponent just dumps their whole hand, that's also a problem. We are likely going to have to name human or druid with the cavern just to be able to cast the Noble Hierarch. So let's go with human, and we are going to play a Noble Hierarch. Now, if our opponent kills this Noble Hierarch, we are in pretty bad shape, but we could already be in bad shape. It just depends what our opponent does this turn. If our opponent does have a plating, that's going to be the worst case scenario. If we just get attacked and then our opponent passes the turn, that's probably the best case scenario. Even then, though, we're still dealing with a bunch of flyers, and we don't have any flyers in hand. So it looks like we're going to 2 poison, and our opponent is passing. Okay. So we could explosives for 1 to get rid of the drum and the pest, but the question is, do we want to do that? So we're pretty scared of losing to infect damage. But if we explosives for 1, that would mean that our Noble Hierarch gets blown up also. So that's a big problem. I think we want to play Thought Knot here, and then next turn we at least have a Thought Knot that can start pressuring our opponent. But we're definitely worried about these Inkmoth Nexuses. So let's see what our opponent's working with. And it looks like 2 lands. So our Thought Knot was a whiff, as we thought was a distinct possibility, especially being on the draw. That Thought Knot can definitely whiff against this deck that just spits out all of their cards. So we're gonna take 4 more poison this turn, most likely, and that's gonna put us on 6 poison. So, all right. So our opponent also played another Signal Pest, which is making Engineered Explosives look more attractive, but we still are worried about the actual lands in the Inkmoth Nexuses. So let's start off by attacking for 5 here with our Thought Knot Seer. And wasn't really expecting our opponent to block, and they did not block. So unfortunately, we pretty much are forced into explosives, using explosives this turn, even though we would like to not do so, to move towards being able to cast Drowner. So, yep, explosives for 1, and then we're just gonna have to pop it. And it is gonna get rid of 3 of our opponent's permanents, but they still have those 2 Inkmoth Nexuses, and if we do not draw an answer to Inkmoth Nexus on our next turn, then we are dead to poison damage. If we do draw an answer to Inkmoth Nexus, then we definitely have a shot. And there's a Vault Scourge. So Sky Spawner is kind of an answer to Inkmoth Nexus. We're going to go ahead and start with an attack here for 4. And we're going to play the Cavern, this time naming Eldrazi. So, assuming our opponent doesn't draw a removal spell, we're going to be able to block with our Sky Spawner on one of the Inkmoth Nexuses. And then next turn, we're going to be able to deploy the Drowner. So, the question is, do we want to go ahead and cast our Eldrazi Displacer this turn? Because what we can do is we can sacrifice a Scion and cast the Displacer. And I think we want to go ahead and do that. So, yeah, let's do that. And if we are allowed to start blinking our Drowner with Eldrazi Displacer, that is one potential way we can find a way out of this game. So we are going to be able to, assuming our opponent, okay, our opponent drew a Darksteel Citadel. So assuming our opponent does go ahead and activate both of these Inkmoth Nexuses, we are going to be able to make a block with the Displacer on this Nexus. Now, our opponent might not have wanted to activate the second Nexus because now Seagate Wreckage enters the equation. And being Hellbent is definitely a good thing for our opponent to be able to draw cards from the Seagate Wreckage, but it looks like the play is just going to be putting us to 9 poison. So we drew another way of another removal spell. So that's good. We're going to be able to attack here for 7. And we probably want to just go ahead and play the Drowner this turn. There are some cards our opponent could draw that kill Drowner, and we would lose because of that. Like if our opponent does draw, say, a Dismember, that's gonna be enough to deal with the Drowner. But something like a Galvanic Blast will not be able to deal with the Drowner, for instance. So, yeah, we're just going to search for a basic here and commit our Drowner to the board. And our opponent's at 7 life, so potentially we're just winning the game next turn if our opponent draws bricks. We can sacrifice the Scion, one of the Scions. Say our opponent animates Inkmoth Nexus. We are going to sacrifice a Scion and tap it. That's the idea. That's basically what we're relying our whole game plan on at this point. We can also tap the Vault Scourge if we feel the need to, but that's far less relevant than the Inkmoth Nexus, considering we're at 9 poison. And so this is a game where it illustrates why Sky Spawners are in the list. Without this Sky Spawner, if this had been our Matter Reshaper, we would have just been dead this game. But having a flying blocker was very important. So it looks like our opponent's going ahead and moving to combat. Potentially was moving to combat with that Vault Scourge and opted not to attack. Drew a second copy of Inkmoth Nexus and now is likely activating Seagate Wreckage. And there's an Ornithopter. So I think we actually do have lethal here. We can use these Scions to tap down our opponent's creatures. Then we can use Displacer if we want to deal with this Inkmoth or one of our various removal spells. So, yeah, we're just going to tap down our opponent's creatures and swing for the win here. We've got a total of 12 damage coming in and our opponent's at 7. So, yep, that's the match.